Hello, welcome back. This is Mr. Warren on community ecology, which is covering limiting factors and succession. And this is again a supplement or a complement to the notes that you're taking from the textbook. As we begin reading, we want to remember that our objectives for this week are knowing how unfavorable abiotic and biotic factors affect species. Rather than calling them unfavorable, we're going to call them limiting factors. Because if they're there in the right percentages and the right amounts, they're not really unfavorable. But if you're missing them, or maybe sometimes if there's too many, then that can be unfavorable. How does that range of tolerance affect the distribution of organisms? And then we'll take a big shift, kind of. In class, we'll talk about how it's not really a big shift. We're talking about succession in ecology, particularly secondary succession and then primary succession. Yes, I'm doing those backwards from the book. It'll make sense when we get there. All right, so limiting factors are discussed on page 61. You'll notice that I skipped page 60. It's mostly review of what communities are and that abiotic factors affect living things, which we talked about in depth in class, so it doesn't feel necessary to add in our video. A limiting factor is anything that limits the amount or the ability to reproduce or where an organism can be distributed. Some really common limiting factors are the amount of water and the temperature of the area. Others include the sunlight, the pH of the soil or the water, how much food there is, if there's competition for those resources, makes them more limited as well. Okay, so we're given a whole slide to this, an entire page in our textbook. Why do we care about limiting factors? Because they limit how much stuff can live, which means that they're generally speaking what's responsible for determining what's capable of living in a given location and how much of it. So if there's not enough water, then certain trees can't grow. And it's particularly important when we talk about which autotrophs can and can't grow, because the autotrophs are the available food for the heterotrophs. So if certain flowers don't grow, then certain pollinators can't live there. So what limits one might limit other things of the food chain as well. That being said, it's not like there's a magic number. Some organisms can do with a little bit less, even if they're in the same species. A good example of this is food and people. You have friends who eat less food than you do. Or maybe you're the person that eats much less food than everyone else. This means that it's very likely that you get by with less calories. Just the same way, one duck might eat less food than another duck. So what limits one duck might not limit another duck. We'll talk about that as a range of tolerance on our next slide. I've reminded myself to look at this picture here. The picture shows a barrel with many missing pieces. And the idea here is that the piece that there's the least of is what determines how high the water can go. In this analogy, the water is the population that we're talking about. And the different slats of the barrel, these guys here, each one of these represents a different limiting factor. We can see that this barrel, this limiting factor, wouldn't let the water any higher than this, and this one won't let the water any higher than that. So maybe this is the temperature, this is the sunlight, this is the amount of water, but this one here is the soil pH. Because the soil pH stops the population from growing before the sunlight and the amount of water. As a result, the actual limiting factor would be the soil pH. The population of the organism can't get any higher because the pH prevents it from going over that amount. If we corrected the soil pH up to, say, here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, I hope you can, up to, say, here, then all of a sudden the amount of water would be the new limiting factor, because that's where the water or the population would start spilling out of our barrel. Okay, next slide. Range of tolerance. This has to do with the limiting factors and things like that as well. Can I have a pointer? That's what I want. Sorry, learning new things every day. Okay, so range of tolerance. We're still on page 61. Tolerance is your ability to deal with something, or an organism's ability to deal with someone. This is how we use the word every day. You can tolerate only so much annoyance from one person, or that smell is more than you can tolerate, or you didn't get enough sleep so you can't function today. You're out of your tolerance, you're too sleep deprived. Yes? So when we talk about the range of tolerance, it's kind of like Goldilocks and the three bears. There's just right in the middle. That's the optimum range. Optimum. That's where everyone wants to be. And the farther we get away from optimum range, the worse off those organisms are. Which means if some factor, abiotic or biotic, is moving away from that optimum range, then we're going to see less of the organism. Hence why this bell curve here goes down, right? Population size is our height, and the limiting factor, or whatever we're tolerating, is on the bottom. The optimal range is marked here in green, because green is good. And the farther we move away from the green line, the less of the organisms we're going to find, and the less capable they are at reproducing and competing and everything else. So back to Goldilocks. When we talk about not having the right amount, we can have too little. Now, there's two areas. There's the stress zone, and there's the dead zone. The technical term is zone of intolerance, but if you can't tolerate something in ecology, you're dead. So that's bad. You'll notice that our population amount drops as soon as we hit into the zone of intolerance. While we're in the stressed zone, it's just going down a lot. We have a few organisms, but they're still there. They're just stressed. They're not in a good place. And the same is true if Goldilocks finds the porridge too hot, if there's too much of it. At a certain point, it becomes too much for the organisms to handle, and so we see less of them. And just like before, we have a zone of intolerance where it gets too much, and that organism literally can't tolerate it anymore, and they die. And that can happen for the whole population. All right. So, when we talk about this, there's the just right. And there's a range of that where we're happy and healthy, but a very optimal moment as well. A really obvious example of this is water temperature. You can imagine a goldfish. That goldfish has a best temperature of water that it lives in. Obviously, that goldfish would die in boiling water. Zone of intolerance. Obviously, that goldfish would die in frozen water, ice. Zone of intolerance. So we can mentally imagine that there's an area between boiling and just right that the goldfish can live but is really unhappy about. That's the stress zone. Or a place between ice and just right where it's cold but not so cold that the goldfish has died. That's our stress zone on the lower limit, whereas the heat is of course the upper limit. All right, now we're switching topics to succession. I'm going to start with page 63 instead of page 62, and we're going to talk about secondary succession first. We're going to talk about secondary succession first because it's far easier to understand, and once we get secondary succession, it's just a quick little hop to making that make sense for primary succession as well. Secondary succession has to start with a disturbance. A disturbance is anything that disturbs the ecosystem or changes or damages the ecosystem. Most commonly in nature, we're going to talk about a fire or a mudslide. When we start adding people, we can talk about bulldozers or plows making farms or clear cutting, logging industries. Those also count as major disturbances. All right, so the idea is that we have a disturbance, and this puts us down to soil. I forgot to write that, so you guys get to watch me write with my awful pen. We start with bare soil, and we have to get to that soil by a disturbance. Then grass grows on the soil. It might not be grass, it could be some other weed, some annual, some plant that shows up very quickly and then dies. Okay? But normally grasses are a pretty clear thing. Sometimes clover and other flowers and the like. Once the flowers and the grasses establish a stable soil structure by the addition of their roots, and by being present, they prevent wind erosion from taking everything away. After that happens, then that stable soil is capable of housing shrubs and bushes. Shrubs and bushes are great. They're not as tall or as slow as trees. They love sunlight, and they're going to further put their roots deeper into the soil, which is going to help water get deeper into the soil. But shrubs don't catch very much shade. So after that soil has been thoroughly established and water is flowing through it because of the shrub roots, then trees are able to grow into that space. And trees are very slow, and particularly we're going to be talking about sun-loving trees because there's no shade yet. Those trees are, over the course of somewhere between 5 and 150 years, seen here, going to grow up and become pretty tall and pretty big, making it a forest. You would think that is done, but then remember that these sun-loving trees are making a lot of shade, and that shade prevents the sun-loving trees from continuing to grow there. And that's where our shade-loving trees come in. Here we see stuff like oaks and hickories, but it's probably different trees in the tropical rainforest where we live right now. So of course it depends on your climate. This of course assumes that there is enough water to house trees. There are some ecosystems that just don't have enough water for trees, and no matter how much time they have, they will never push into that trees. Some good examples of this are the American Southwest. It's kind of a desert. They're never going to have trees. Other examples of this are South Dakota, Nebraska. They have enough water to have grasses and in some places shrubs, but they're never going to have enough water for trees. So the climax community here is determined by climate. Let's draw a connecting line to that. Climate determines climax community. Now, we talked about fires and bulldozers and forests being cut down to be these big disturbances, and that can cause some large-scale secondary succession. However, if you have a small fire, maybe a lightning strike or a tree falls over in the woods, that gives us more sunlight and it changes a little bit. And that little bit goes through the successionary process. And so you get different types of plants, you get your grasses and your shrubs in that older forest. And that increases your biodiversity, which is good for a lot of reasons. So I want to connect some words that they've shown here, and they're good vocab words to know. Annual plants and grasses are called pioneer species in secondary succession. It's a term you should know. There's some super pioneer species, for lack of a better word, that we'll talk about in primary succession. Then our shrubs and bushes are called intermediate species, maybe even our sun-loving trees, if you want to add oaks and stuff into that as well. Then our climax community is our shade-loving trees. That's generally speaking our old-growth forests, our maples, our walnuts, our hickories. They're slower trees because with the shade means less photosynthesis. But they're able to tolerate that better. So these shade-loving trees have a different range of tolerance than the sun-loving trees. So what's happening here in succession is that as the plants change the abiotic factors, they're also then going to change where they are in their own personal range of tolerance. And so as the abiotic factors change, it moves into the optimal range for species that weren't previously there, which is pretty cool. We'll work on that concept a lot more in class. You'll notice that I've only talked about plants in terms of succession. We don't talk about animal communities in terms of succession, because the animal communities are dependent on the type of vegetation that is there for their primary consumers to eat. So as the plants change, so also the animals change. Okay, now we're on primary succession. So it's a little bit different than secondary succession, but it's only different in where it starts. You'll know that secondary succession starts with a fire or something putting us down to bare soil. Primary succession starts with bare rock. Some really common causes of primary succession are volcanoes, that plays out new rock. That's of course going to be primary succession. There is maybe a big mudslide that exposes a lot of new rock on a hillside or something like that. Maybe a typhoon or some huge amount of water that pushes away all of the available soil. Since we don't have any soil, that changes what can grow. Namely, all that we can grow are mosses and lichens. Mosses are those fuzzy green plants that you see in damp places. And lichen is algae that's mixed with fungus, and the fungus gives it structure and the algae gives it food, and it works out very nicely. They can live anywhere. You see them on the sides of trees, you see them on rocks, and because they can live in many places, they can live on bare rock. They die and then decompose. And as that's happening, when they grow, they're like breaking up the rock a little bit, and then when they die, they decompose, and then the decomposed parts and the broken up bits of rock starts to make soil. For those of you following along in the picture, we're now here. So decomposition creates a layer of topsoil. Now that we have soil, primary succession looks a lot like secondary succession. With soil, you get grasses and annuals and weeds, and then those turn into shrubs, and then those turn into sun-loving trees, and then those turn into shade-loving trees, and then you're at a climax community. And in primary succession, we're watching the soil level grow. And that's one of the particularly important things. Trees don't generally do well in shallow soil. They need to get their roots down in it. I wish this picture had included roots. Let's include some roots. Right? Our little shrubs have little roots, and our big trees have big roots. And so they need to wait for the soil to build up. So primary succession is entirely determined by building up the soil. Secondary succession is built up by changing those abiotic factors. But once we get to grasses, primary succession and secondary succession tend to look very similar. So primary succession, we have to prime it by creating soil with our colonizers like moss and lichen. Secondary succession, we're coming back from a disturbance like a fire. Okay? And that's the end of our slideshow. I hope that was helpful. Please feel free to start a discussion board with questions and comments. Additionally, please make sure that you've updated your notes with any new information that I've included that your reading might not have. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.